Hi, this is Glenn Martin. I'm talking through the subjects in week 2, which is headed Moral Reasoning. Although you'll notice that part of the textbook reading is about ethical decision making. So I just wanted to point out at the outset that talking about ethical decision making involves, to me, 3 things, only one of which is covered in the textbook reading this week, which is fine. In the textbook reading, you're looking at a framework for understanding ethical decision making. So that's what's being offered here. In later weeks, I want to talk about, in addition, 2 other aspects of ethical decision making. The first one is the process of making a decision, taking into account ethical values, and the other one is the criteria that we use when making ethical decisions. Now those are 3 distinct things. The framework, which is on page 129, I think is very good because it introduces you to the major factors that you want to include when you're making a decision with regard to ethics. The other 2 things that we're leaving until later is the process that you might go through, which is step-by-step thing. And the third thing is, because the process is not complete in itself, it's just a process, what you also need is the criteria that you are going to bring to making that decision, which is the values that you will apply. So bear that in mind, put that to one side. So we're back to moral reasoning, which is really, we call that meta-ethics as well, because it's not really about the content of ethics, it's about how you go about moral reasoning, or what's involved in it. So all the meta issues that surround the core issue of ethics. That's the subject this week. Now, this is done in the study guide and in the textbook through looking at this idea of the development of moral reasoning. We're looking at 2 major thinkers of the 20th century on this subject, primarily Lawrence Kohlberg, because that's probably the most influential theory of moral development that's been around. And then Kohlberg Gilligan, who initially was a student and an associate of Kohlberg's, started to have reservations about his approach, which was heavily cognitive, coming as it did from Piaget's theory of child development, and Piaget was interested in cognitive development. Gilligan began to think that this cognitive emphasis missed something. And talking in the late 60s and in the 70s, in the era when everything was changing, and among everything else, civil rights uprest and everything else in America and around the world, there was also the gender question, the question of feminism. So Kohlberg Gilligan's work pretty much is an attempt to articulate feminist perspective in the area of ethics. And it's very challenging. If you come from that male cognitive perspective where ethics is about universal laws and abstract rules, you might say, then Kohlberg Gilligan's work is very much embedded in the emotions and in relationships. The unanswered question in the content this week is, how do you reconcile those 2 things? My understanding is that you can reconcile these things, and that you have to draw on both the cognitive and the emotional in order to find a balanced view and a balanced approach towards ethics. So Kohlberg's work is a cognitive approach. And if you've read the textbook and the article by Crane and the study guide, you'll know what's here, that it was a longitudinal study and it interviewed boys. It was middle-class boys. That's the defining characteristic of it. And he was talking to them. He was asking questions about their verbal rationalizations for ethical behavior. The result of his study was a model of moral development that has 3 basic levels. And there's a movement in that he says is one way, irrevocable. So that he was saying that children growing up to be adults progress through these levels in an invariant way. They go through level 1, pre-conventional, level 2, conventional, and level 3, which he calls post-conventional. And then once you've reached that certain level, you don't go back, because your view incorporates all the elements from the previous levels, and they're part of your knowing, so you don't go back. Mind you, we're talking about thinking. It doesn't mean that behavior can't regress to previous levels. Bear that in mind. And within each level, he has 2 stages. And I think you'd be able to relate fairly intuitively to these levels. So that the pre-conventional stage is pretty much focused on consequences. Punishment, which leads to obedience. The conventional stage is more about belonging. It's that you wish to be accepted by a social group, which leads to what he calls good boy, nice girl. The more generalized form of that is law and order. So from looking at social conventions in your immediate group, in your classroom, your mates, you extend that to society as a whole and say, well, we need to have laws and conventions, moral conventions about what's right and wrong in order to survive. The universal level, post-conventional, there are 2 stages in that as well. One which is more a contractual kind of arrangement, where as an individual you contract with the society to behave in certain ways, what you do, what you won't do. The 6th stage, the last stage that Kohlberg posits, is this universal stage, which is about universal ethical principles. It's personal, it's about conscience, it's about your responsibility to yourself. So the main points about Kohlberg's model, the starting point really is what's most common in society and in human groups, which he says is conventional morality, a shared understanding of what is right or good that maintains the existing social norms. What comes prior to that is really just selfishness, where a person acts in order to advance their own personal interests, so that it's egocentric. It's not really ethical at all. It's pre-ethical. And the post-conventional stage is where you start to look beyond what's socially accepted to what you might say, what you really think is right. And you're looking from a higher standpoint you're looking beyond even your own society's value systems to what's universal, what's global. So to summarise what Kohlberg offers, it's the idea that people display different forms of moral reasoning. And I think this is really important, apart from anything else, that when you talk about ethics, you can't assume that everybody comes from the same place that you do. You can't assume that people even come from the same level of thinking that you do. If somebody is at that stage where they're still egocentric, even narcissistic, and their only interest is their own selfish interests, then the only thing that you will get in a conversation about ethics is what they layer over that selfishness in order to tell you what you want. So that's where in organisations and business you get public relations, where executives and organisations say the things that they think people want them to say. Yes, we are an ethical company, when the truth is completely otherwise. They're only really telling you that to put you off the scent. The other things from Kohlberg are that I think generally accepted, and I certainly accept, is that idea that moral reasoning does come in different stages, and that those stages occur for a person and perhaps for a society in a sequential form, and that the later stages build on the earlier ones. They don't replace them, they expand them. And also, the other points that Kohlberg made is that there's no guarantee of moral development. Something has to happen, or there has to be something in the environment that occurs that triggers people to want to move. And usually what that is that when you come across a situation where there's a conflict or a contradiction, and you have to resolve it in some way. And much growth is about finding that your existing ways of understanding situations, your existing rules don't work because there's something that you haven't accounted for. I'd like to come back to that in later stages of the course, yes, stages. So Kohlberg is saying that most people in society are at that conventional stage of moral development where you might even say it's not truly ethical yet, that it's based on wanting to belong. It's basically about going along with what society thinks. Conventional. So Carol Gilligan comes along and she starts to think there's something that's not being taken into account in Kohlberg's approach. He's presenting boys, and boys only, with dilemmas that he has constructed, and he wants responses to those case studies. And Carol Gilligan's approach was a little bit different in that she wasn't just making it a cognitive issue. She wanted to get at people's experience, and in particular women. What was their experience facing ethical situations? What were the situations they thought of as being ethical? And that's fairly critical too. And what she was trying to do was represent ethical experience in a way that made sense of how women commonly saw the world. Gilligan certainly agreed with the idea of moral development and the idea that people go through different stages, but her description of the stages was somewhat different. If you look at the first stage there, pre-conventional stage, there's a commonality with what Kohlberg says and what Gilligan is saying, that first stage is egocentric, it's about my survival. That's the most important thing. And there's not much else happening apart from that. That's where the focus is. In the second level, the conventional level, there's a shift from being just concerned with myself to being concerned with other people. But here the emphasis between her and Kohlberg starts to shift, because she's saying this concern for the other is not about the fairness of rules so much as concern for the other person's well-being. So there's an altruism about it, and even an aspect of self-sacrifice. You don't need to take that as doing that to my own detriment. It's merely saying that when you start to be concerned for the well-being of other people, you sometimes encounter situations where you may have to do that at some personal cost. The post-conventional stage of Gilligan looks very different from Kohlberg, except for the fact that there's a universality about it. That's what's common. The universality is about the principles. But in articulating those principles, the focus is more on relationships and the well-being of others, rather than the concept of fairness and justice. This is what's different. So Gilligan is saying the mature stage of moral development, when you take it from a feminine perspective, is the goal of harmony between people, and the idea of non-harm, that you do not harm others, and that in a positive sense you seek to nurture relationship between people, which is about, if you try and fill that out, it's about warmness, it's about trust, those things. Not so much the abstract rules of fairness and justice that Kohlberg was interested in. Now at this point, it's worth stepping back and reminding ourselves that both Kohlberg and Gilligan were talking about what people say about ethics, what people say they will do, what sort of reasons they put forward. But people can do all of that and still behave abominably. So James Rest, who's written some good things, has what I think is a very complete model of what's involved in moral actions. So he's saying the first thing is people have to have some ethical awareness. They have to be able to recognize that an issue is a moral issue. The second thing is that they have to have the reasoning capacity. So all the things that Kohlberg and Gilligan talked about is about the ability to make moral judgments, about the ability to analyze a situation, see what the ethical issues are that are involved, and bring reasoning to that and make a decision. Right? So that number two there is what Gilligan and Kohlberg and others are talking about. But Rest is saying there are these other aspects involved. So after coming to a moral decision, we then have to be able to establish a moral intent, which is, in other words, we have to have the commitment that we will follow through on that judgment that we've come to. And beyond that, we need to implement our moral action. And I might say also to do that consistently and reliably over time. And you could say that there are skills involved in that as well as courage. Courage is a big part of that. So I think Kohlberg, Gilligan, the idea of what's involved in making moral judgments is critical, it's essential, but it's best at the end to put it into James Rest's model that we need to think about more than that, because there's no point in ethics if it doesn't come to be reflected in the way people behave. Now we ask the question, how might all of this relate to business? And you might think that if it's true of individuals that they go through stages of moral development, perhaps that's also true of organisations and businesses. And I would think that's true, and there are writers who have explored that question. I should also say that we've really just looked at two people this week in terms of stages of moral development, but there are significant other thinkers who've provided different frameworks that I think take on some of the unanswered questions about the conflict, if you like, between Kohlberg and Gilligan and their models. But just to throw in some quick comments about ethics and business, here are some contrary views. And the first one is a quote from a character in that science fiction novel that I mentioned before, The Ethos Effect. And a character says, if you don't chart a course based on ethics, then you're for sale to the highest bidder or the most insistent one. So that one of the aspects that we're certainly interested in this course is that thinking about ethics helps you to establish your own position about ethics, and that's really important, because when ethical conflicts arise, sometimes they're policy issues that you have time to think about, but very often they come upon you suddenly and you may need to make a decision now. And unless you've given some thought to what you base your ethics on beforehand, this quote holds. You're for sale to the highest bidder. You need to think about ethics and establish what is the basis for the way I operate ethically, and then how do I want to use my influence in an organisation to influence the ethics of the organisation. There's a quote there from Theodore Roosevelt, who was the president of the USA around 1900, setting the standard. And for him, the biggest corporation, like the humblest private citizen, must be held to strict compliance with the will of the people. And I think he's also saying that the laws of the land should reflect the will of the people, in the sense that the laws should protect the well-being of the whole as much as they can. And then there's a quote from Andrew Young, the cynical quote that says, nothing is illegal if 100 businessmen decide to do it. And we all know there's some truth in that, because business people seek to influence the laws of the land as well. And yet, we finish up with an optimistic quote from Peter Cooper a long time ago, 1874. And his perspective is, I have always recognised that the object of business is to make money in an honourable manner. I have endeavoured to remember that the object of life is to do good. And you might ask, well, where does that fit in the Kohlberg or Gilligan models of moral development? And it certainly suggests that there is a person there who is committed to living at that level 3 in either of those two models. So that's it for this week. We come back to the idea of ethical decision making again, remembering my opening remark that ethical decision making involves, first of all, a framework for understanding ethics and the factors that come into it. And then you need a process that you're going to use to undertake an ethical decision. And thirdly, you need some criteria that you will apply in making that decision.